Star Wars Geek Girls. They're geek girls that like Star Wars. And sometimes cry.
That's a good intro.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Star Wars Geek Girl. I'm Zoe, and I'm not here with Lizzy today, but I'm here with my dad from the Inflatable Falcon podcast.
Hello, yeah, I'm Zoe's dad from Inflatable Falcon podcast and helping out with this podcast.
Yeah. So, today we're going to be talking about Star Wars books and getting into Star Wars books. Because I've read all of them, but I understand not everyone does that for some reason. And some people, there's a lot of Star Wars books, and some people might want to get into it, but it can be really intimidating with how many books there are, and you don't know where to start, and if you got to read them all, and if you know what you might need. So I'm going to talk, and so I'm talking to someone who has read all of them, all the canon books. I'll say this is just about canon books. I cannot help you with legends, but I'm going to be talking about, that as the experience of someone who's read them all, and my dad's going to talk about the experience as someone who's read a couple of Star Wars books.
Right. Yeah, I have not read, especially the newer ones. I haven't read that as many as you. So
yeah. So we're going to talk about that. There is, because it's not going to be posted right or when we record. So there is a book review of every canon Star Wars book on StarWarsGeek.com, unless probably the newest book, The Reign of Empire, Mask of Fear, because I'm posting my aftermath review on Monday, and then the new book comes out on Tuesday. So I'll read that and review that when I get as soon as I can. But
this will probably come out the day after then, right? Because we have you have a new episode that I got to put up tonight, so you have to give it a little room.
Yes, so there are a lot of books, and so I just wanted to kind of talk about it because sometimes people, ask, and it can be, you're not sure if what you need. And you can talk about your experience on choosing which books to read or listen to.
Okay.
But yeah, before we start, where can people find you and the Inflatable Falcon?
Every Wednesday night, or almost every Wednesday night, on YouTube. You just look up Inflatable Falcon. I think it's on the Star Wars Geek Girl YouTube page. And Hinton Star Wars Family on TikTok, Instagram, or Michael Hinton on Facebook.
Yeah, and everybody remember you can go to StarWarsGeekGirl.com to vote in our monthly polls, as well as read all of my amazing book reviews and blog articles. And you can sign up and subscribe if you want email updates about new stuff, or just sign up for our newsletter that comes out once a month on there. StarWarsGeekGirl.com is also currently has some information on it about our upcoming Star Wars Celebration in Japan panel. I will be on the HoloNet news stage at 11:30 a.m. on Saturday.
And that's Japanese time.
Yes, Japanese time. So we're planning on live streaming it right now. We just have to figure out what we can bring to Japan and everything like that. But if it is live streamed, that will be, if you're in the US, that will be like kind of late at night or in the evening, US time. If you're elsewhere in the world, whatever Japan time is for you,
right?
7:30 a.m.
You might have to link like a time
zone like converter,
zone thing on Star Wars Geek Girl or something.
Yes. I'm very excited. It'll be me and Lizzy. It'll be my 5th time speaking at Star Wars Celebration, and it'll be the first time since Celebration Orlando where Lizzy and I are both at Star Wars Celebration.
Right, that's cool.
So I'm really excited for that, and also just to be in Tokyo.
Yeah.
Make sure to follow Star Wars Geek Girl. Up for you, what you were talking. Make sure to follow Star Wars Geek Girl on Instagram, Blue Sky, at SW Geek Girl, and on Facebook at Star Wars Geek Girl. And since I forgot yours, let me put yours up too.
You don't need. You have ones for me too. Oh wow, fancy for the people watching. It's at Hinton Star Wars on Star Wars Family on TikTok, at the Hitting Star Wars Family on Instagram, Hitting Star Wars Family on YouTube, and at Hitting Star Wars Family on Blue Sky.
My logo is covering up your. Yeah.
It's
and if you're just looking for me personally, I just changed all these so I had to re-upload them and mix them up. If you're looking for me personally on Instagram and TikTok at Spectre5 and on Blue Sky at Azalika. So yeah.
So here, I'll give you my history of the books first, since mine's probably more boring than yours. But when Star Wars first came out, there was like a few comic books, and then Marvel did a run. I don't know if comic books fall into books or not. But then they had some novels that came out. In the when the novels really hit was, I want to say, in the early 90s or something, like Heir to the Empire, I think, was the first one. And for me, it gave me an excuse not to read them. I had seen an interview with George Lucas, and he said the books didn't really count. So that kind of, until Shadows of the Empire came out, then I did read Shadows of the Empire. But until that, I tried a few. When I drove truck, we used to get pre-read copies. They would just give us the driver's books. And so I tried reading like Dark Saber, which I didn't. It just didn't really flow for me. I'm sure it was a good book, but I think honestly, before the new book, Shadows of the Empire was really the only one I read, other than making of and stuff like that. So, but I know how you got into Star Wars books, but you could tell everyone.
Yeah, so I never really read Legends. There was I read a couple of the Legends, mostly Clone Wars stuff. Like I was never really into I know there's like the whole era of Legends that's like post Return of the Jedi. I never read any of those. But I read a couple of those like Clone Wars little books, and comics and things like that. But then when Disney bought Star Wars and the reset, and there was a canon reset and said all the books count, I was like, well, that's great. And the first book was a prequel to this new show called Star Wars Rebels. It was a prequel book called A New Dawn, all about Kanan and Hera, and I read that, and I really liked it. And so I kind of kept up. There would be times where I would be getting through, like recently, I've been getting through a book a week, for Star Wars. There were times where I would get through a book a month or a book a year, and I would, be in and out, and the books kept coming out, fell behind for a little bit, caught up, fell behind again, and so on. But I got really into reading all the canon books. And then after a couple years, I started posting book reviews on Star Wars Geek Girl. I think the first one I did was for the Adventures in Wild Space series, just a short 5 or 6 book series that I read. And then I would review books as I read them. And then I ran out of books to read for the first time in review. So I started rereading books and reviewing them. And then for a while, I'd go in between where I'd read a new book, and then I would run out of new books. So I'd go back to rereading those old books and getting reviews until I just caught up. Just now, I reread the Aftermath trilogy.
Right. Now, of the books you've read, I don't want you to pick your favorite, because I'm sure everyone has its certain point. But what one like would you see yourself? What would be the one you go back to read again, or something like that?
Ooh, honestly, and I would like to reread them again at some point. I've only read them once, but the Alphabet Squadron trilogy.
Okay.
I just adored that trilogy. I loved all the characters. Hera features in it pretty heavily. I love her. So probably that one, but also like the Ahsoka book I've read a couple of times, and I really love that book. Leia, Princess of Alderaan. I actually do want to, even though I don't have to reread it for a book review, I do want to reread Bloodline again for the 3rd time, I think.
Now, I know they're not canon, but you also, when you were little, you liked the was there a Star Wars high school book that you read?
Ooh, the Origami Yoda series.
Oh, the Origami Yoda series. Yes.
Yeah, those were not set in Star Wars. So there was the Jedi Academy books.
Jedi Academy, that's what I was thinking.
Those were different. And I don't think I read a couple of those, but those were more like if the Jedi were just like high school. It was
Yeah,
kind
it's
of
kind
into those.
it,
The Origami Yoda books that I read, all of those were about real life kids who were big fans of Star Wars and would make origami Star Wars characters. And those are
and
really
you
good books.
and you got to meet the author
And I did get to meet the author.
when you were a Jawa,
And he's still written for Star Wars recently.
right?
He
And you
wrote
interviewed,
some short stories, and he wrote The Mighty Chewbacca and the Forest of Fear, which is another
right?
great book. Has Chewbacca teaming up with K2SO.
Yeah. Well, you and Sal do a lot of book reviews too. You've
Yes.
been on his show a bunch
Yeah, I
of
think
times.
Sal might be, because Sal's more well read than me Star Wars wise, because he's kept up with all the comics. I'm catching up on the comics.
Well, I see. I like the Star Wars comics in the '90s. I did read them all the Tales of the Jedi, the Heir to all the adaptations, and I really like the Dark Horse comics. See all the series back then.
I used to read the Dark Horse Clone Wars comics.
Yeah, Dark Horse. That
Catching up on Star Wars comics, I recently read the Star Wars 2015 run, the first Vader run, the first Afra run, the Poe Dameron comics, and the Princess Leia ones, a couple miniseries. I love the Leia comics a lot. That's really good.
I like. I mean, I like reading books or when I cheat and listen to them on audio. Because if you don't know a character, it lets you create the character in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
But the comics, if you like the artist, the comics are good too. But you lose the power of creating what they look like.
Yeah.
So
Agreed.
Dark Horse, especially. The new Star Wars comics are nice too, but Dark Horse, especially when I was reading them, I always like going in a comic book store and just looking at the covers. Like the covers, even if you got a Dark Horse comic you didn't really like, the covers were always so beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And you were bad with the Dark Horse comics because when you were real little, you used to read the Clone Wars, but you would cut out all the pages that had ads.
Yeah.
I would come and see these butchered up comic books.
Yeah. So yeah, that's our history with Star Wars books. And so I want to kind of talk about some of the things that I think, like questions that I've gotten from people who want to get into books, or just things that I think, can be a barrier for people that doesn't actually have to be a barrier. And I think the biggest one that I think a lot of people are afraid of is if the books are connected. Because like we run into that sometimes with the TV shows. People are like, oh, well, do I have to watch Book of Boba Fett to watch The Mandalorian? Do I have to watch The Mandalorian to watch Ahsoka? Do I have to watch Rebels? And all this stuff. And because, with a lot of the shows, like Ahsoka picks up off of Star Wars Rebels, and the Book of Boba Fett and Mandalorian really intertwined with a lot of their characters. And with the books, generally, that's not really the case. Now, it's obviously, if it's, say, like the Aftermath trilogy, that's a trilogy of books. If you pick up the second or the third one, you're going to get a little confused.
Right.
But generally, and the High Republic, which I'm going to finish with the High Republic, because that's a beast of its own, the High Republic.
Right.
But generally, if it's not part of a series or trilogy, and if it's not part of the High Republic, you can pick up any Star Wars book and read it, and you won't really miss anything.
Yeah. Well, and also what's really nice about them, especially now that they're connected, then if you really like it and you watch something or read another book, most of the time it's not going to be contradicted.
Mm-hmm.
Like when they killed Chewie with a planet in one of those books. Spoiler alert for like a 20-some-year-old book. But then that kind of throws off anyone that wants to write about Chewie.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what I like the most, because I'm not reading them as fast as you are, but I do like it that when I read one, overall, I don't have to worry about it being contradicted. Not that that really matters either. Like, so it doesn't mean like you can't read the Legends books, but sometimes people just like to keep like the continuity.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's the thing. And there are some times where I think a really good example is the book Resistance Reborn that takes place between The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker.
Mm-hmm.
And that book pulls a lot of people in, other book characters, other comic characters, video game characters, but you don't need to know any of those people, and it doesn't affect the story.
Right.
You know,
Right.
you can be the book is mostly about Finn and Poe, and Rose and Ryan. Everyone's there, but mostly Finn and Poe are kind of the main leads there. And so you're reading the story about Finn and Poe, and someone else shows up, and someone will say, "Oh, this is Shriv. He's one of our rebel agents. He's working right now." And that's all you need to know for the purposes of that book. But then if you want to know more about Shriv, you can go play Battlefront 2.
Right.
And that's
Right.
how really, and it's very rare that the books really overlap like that. But you never need to know, like one of the love interests in the Aftermath trilogy, his name's Condor. He appears very briefly in the book Last Shot.
Okay.
He's working for Leia. And so when I've read the Aftermath trilogy, when I read Last Shot, I'm like, oh, that's Condor. He's still working for Leia. That's cool. Good for him. But if you're just reading Last Shot, all you need to know about Condor is that he can help Han and Lando do some slicing.
Right.
Which the book explains for you.
Well, and that's what's nice too, though, is because I know when Force Awakens came out, they took a lot of those background characters that were like the Crimson Corsair.
Yeah.
And a couple, and I think they made little books or mini stories or comics about those, and it helps. It just helps you to fill the story and make it better.
Yeah.
If you want.
Absolutely. And you don't you don't have to. And I think that's something people worry about getting into Star Wars in general, with books especially. And I will tell you, very, very rarely will a character from another book show up in a major capacity.
Right.
And unless it's middle of a trilogy, and unless it's the High Republic, you really don't need to go and read that other story. You can, if you read a book and you think, that guy sounds kind of cool, go to his Wikipedia and see what else he's been in, and go read all about him or her or them. And I think that's what's so great about Star Wars books. And there are a lot of Star Wars books. One example is like Lost Stars is a great example, one of the earlier books. It's about two characters named Thane and Sienna. Thane and Sienna, to this day, haven't appeared in anything else since that book came out. And that was one of the first Star Wars books to come out in canon. And there's no background to them before. You can read that book on its own, and it's the only Star Wars book you've ever read, and you're not missing anything. And that's what you can do with Star Wars books.
And so do you, because I know they have a story group and they try to keep stuff somewhat like the same, but is there any authors? Like, so if someone's wants to start and they're like, well, I'm not really sure of what content I want, but do you have a style of author that would be an easy entry level into Star Wars?
Yeah, and that's a good question. So Star Wars books generally are divided between young adult and adult. So if maybe you aren't like an avid reader, you don't like to read bigger, heavier books, I think starting with the young adult books is a really great intro. I don't have any young adult books with me. But like, for example, this is the second book in the Aftermath trilogy. This is Aftermath Life Debt. It's a pretty, not too bad. I think it's like 500 or so pages. But it's a pretty hefty book if you're not someone who likes to read, or you're someone who wants to get back into reading or anything, like that. So like a shorter young adult book like the Ahsoka books, and the Queen's trilogy about Padme, all those books are written by E.K. Johnston. Those I think they're easier to read, still very good stories, but easier to read. So I'd say look for young adult if you're looking for something a bit lighter. I also think what's nice about Star Wars is that we have a lot of short story collections.
Yeah.
I think those are great for someone who wants to ease their way in, and because it's in every story is in these small digestible bits. I just did a review recently. You mentioned the Crimson Corsair. That story is from the Aliens short story collection.
Right.
And that's a really great book. It's a lot of fun. Each of the stories is very different. There's one story that's very like Frankenstein-esque horror story.
Okay.
But then you have a story that's like a murder mystery, but also a cooking show murder mystery.
Well, that
That's
might
where
all.
Corsair
Oh, go.
stories is like a race. And so that's a really good short story collection. There's stories of Jedi and Sith, I believe is what it's called, which is some of the stories are retellings of Clone Wars episodes. Some of the stories are original short stories, mostly in the Clone Wars. But my absolute favorite short story collections, they're a bit bigger, but like I said, they're in these small digestible bits, is the From a Certain Point of View trilogy.
Yeah, they are very good.
Those are very good. They were it's $3, each one released for the 40th anniversary of one of the original trilogy movies. Super fun. Even though it's a trilogy, you can pick up any of them, and as long as, like, if you pick up Return of the Jedi, as long as you've seen Return of the Jedi, you'll be just
Yeah, right. Well, and it also might make people want to go rewatch it because some of those characters are super background characters.
Yeah. And so whenever someone says if they're more into short stories, I recommend From a Certain Point of View. Because it's 40 stories, 40 different authors, 40 or more different authors. Some of them are co-written. And they're really fun. Some of them are about, like, none of them about, like, Luke, Leia, Han.
Right.
But some of them are about, like, Lando or Obi-Wan or Yoda. Some are about other book characters. The first one is about a character from the Ahsoka novel, as well as one about Dr. Aphra in the first one.
Oh.
And then some are about, like, Return of the Jedi. I remember there's two Ewoks where the one Ewok gets shot, and the other Ewok is crying. That's a whole story in Return of the Jedi. And it's actually really, really sad. And so I recommend the short story collections for sure. If you
Now,
want
do you have
to.
a favorite? Do you have an author you prefer? Like, if you're like it, or
I really like Claudia Gray.
okay, we met her at didn't we? Were you?
I
with
did
us?
briefly. Well, we didn't really meet her. She sat next to us in the Obi-Wan Kenobi premiere at Celebration.
Right. No, but we met her at. I thought maybe you weren't with me then. When we met her at Fan Expo in Philly.
No, I don't think I was with you.
I don't think you were.
But we sat next to her at the Obi-Wan Kenobi premiere, and it was young Leia. And I was like, it's still one of my biggest Celebration regrets, because she wrote the Young Leia books. And my biggest regret is that I didn't ask her what she thought about young Leia in the show. Because she's sitting next to us. But I do like Claudia Gray. I like her character writing a lot. She's written a lot for High Republic. She's also wrote Leia, Princess of Alderaan, which is one of my favorite young adult books. And she wrote the Bloodlines novel about older Leia, a little bit closer to Force Awakens time, when it's found out by everyone that she is Darth Vader's daughter. So that's some other books. So I like Claudia Gray a lot. E.K. Johnston, she wrote Ahsoka. She wrote the Queen's trilogy. I enjoy her work.
No, I haven't read as many as yours, but the Padme, the first book that's one of my top books.
Yes.
Which I know I'm not in the demographic, but I just thought it was I like books that make the movies better.
Yes.
Not all books have to do that, but for me, like, if a book makes me, like, just appreciate things that I didn't think I needed to appreciate before, I think it makes it better.
Yeah, and I with the Queen's trilogy especially, so the first one takes place right after Phantom Menace.
Right.
But then the second one is a prequel to the first book, but it takes place during the Phantom Menace. And so you're seeing this other side. You're seeing what the handmaidens are doing during the Phantom Menace, like in the background the whole time. Right. And then the third book is about Padme in like the early days of the Clone Wars. So trilogy. But that kind of brings me to another thing I want to talk about, which is when you're picking your first Star Wars canon book, it's important to think about what you like about Star Wars and what draws you to Star Wars. Because if you are the person who watches, those long Senate scenes and you're bored out of your mind, you might
Right.
not want to read something like Bloodline, which is a really good book, but it is a lot of long Senate scenes that you're reading in that book. And so I think that's the important thing. I think, we all, if you're someone that likes all Star Wars, that's great. You probably will like all books. But think of like what movies you like, what characters that you like, and what parts of Star Wars that you like. If you don't care at all about the Jedi, if you don't like the Jedi, you might not like books like the High Republic books that are heavily about the Jedi.
Right.
But if you really like the movie Solo had a number of tie-in books. So you might like a book like Most Wanted about Han and Kira before Solo. Or you might like Last Shot, which is a really good, it's Daniel Jose Older, another really great writer. Is a story that it's two stories at once in the same book that kind of tie together. It's actually more like 4 stories in the same book, but you have stories about Han and Lando kind of around Solo time, but then also
Now, what
stories
book is that?
about Lando after Return of the Jedi. Last Shot. I
Last
really
Shot.
recommend it. There's a creepy droid cult. It's so good. Also has Lando being an uncle to Baby Ben and Chewie being an uncle to Baby Ben. It's very cute.
Cool.
But it's like if you like Solo, look at the tie-in books. E.K. Johnston just wrote Crimson Climb, all about Kira climbing the ranks of Crimson Dawn.
Maybe you need to make a list of, if you like this, try these books.
It probably should.
If you like this, because like what kept me from the books for the longest time is I liked Han, Luke, and Leia, and Chewie, and C-3PO, but I felt like all the books were, the early books, they had too much of them together.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because part of the one I liked about them was on in Empire Strikes Back when they weren't together and they were like doing their own little thing,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So I think that's probably the most important thing. If someone takes away anything from this podcast about how to get into Star Wars books, it's figure out what you like about Star Wars. Whatever shows and movies are your favorites, there's probably books with the same characters or taking place around the same time. If you like going to Batuu, if you like going to Galaxy's Edge, there are a lot of books all about Galaxy's Edge or taking place in Galaxy's Edge. If you really liked, and it doesn't have to just be like the same characters necessarily. Like if you loved Andor, I might recommend you the like if you like the political side of Andor, I would probably recommend you Bloodline or the Thrawn trilogy. That's
Okay.
And even Tarkin, like it's all very political. It's not as like even Thrawn, most of the action scenes are him commanding starships, not actually being in the starship. But if you want that action, if you want to read a good dogfight, then read the Alphabet Squadron trilogy. If you like Rebels, read A New Dawn. If you like Anakin and Obi-Wan, read Brotherhood. Like there is a book for you. I will recommend a book that came out last year that I loved, which was The Living Force by John Jackson Miller, who also wrote New Dawn. It's an adventure it's basically the members of the Jedi Council. They basically go on a little like road trip and have to save a planet because Qui-Gon walks in the chamber and he says, "You guys don't get out in the galaxy enough." And they're all like, "Yeah, he's right." And so they go out on a trip. It's a great book.
And what was the name of that book?
The Living Force.
The Living Force.
By John Jackson Miller. It's very, very good. I loved it a lot. And it also, I think that book, you were talking about like making the characters better. It gives so much personality to each of the members of the council that you don't really get to see.
That's the kind of book a lot of people like to read because then when they're watching the movie, it gives them something to think about when they go around that council.
Yeah, and I think something that I didn't expect out of that book was it made me love Ki-Adi-Mundi.
Oh, really?
And yes, because in that book, the way he's written is he's so awkward, and he's everyone's trying to like talk to him. He's like has this kind of one-track mind about stuff, but he's so awkward. Like some lady is flirting with him, and he's just focused on the fact that he dropped his snow cone like on the ground, and that's all he cares about. It's so funny, and we get to learn like Plo Koon was like really into like working on the ships. We learned that Saesee Tiin, one of his biggest jobs was fixing ships at the Jedi Temple. Like that was his main thing before the Clone Wars started. Was he was the guy in the hangar fixing everything, and he didn't want anyone to bother him. He just wanted to work on stuff, and everyone's coming in and trying to yap at him. He doesn't care, and it's just seeing these things. I think the same thing with the Queen's trilogy. It enhances the Phantom Menace quite a bit when you see when they film, they just had the handmaiden walk to the background, but she's on a mission to go find something, from the book.
Yeah, that's what I like. That's what I like.
Yeah. And I think but also like if you're someone who you're like, I love my movies the way they are. I don't want to touch them. I don't want to change how I look at them. There are plenty of books for you. I mentioned the Lost Stars novel. Those characters are pretty much just independent. The only thing really from the movies in that book, besides like Alderaan, when the destruction of Alderaan, destruction of the Death Star affects those characters, but they don't affect that. It's like the movies affect them. The biggest impact that book has on the movies is that it explains the Star Destroyer that Rey is scavenging in The Force Awakens.
Oh, okay.
On Jakku.
That's good.
But I think
is there any non-in-universe books that you really like timelines or behind the scenes? Or
Timelines is great. Timelines is a great resource. I really liked. This is kind of a nerd answer. I think it was called Star Wars in Numbers, is what it was called.
Oh yeah. That's like all graphs and stuff.
Yeah, it's like graphing out parts of Star Wars. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it has the exact number of blaster bolts fired in a New Hope.
Oh, that's funny.
Like it's very cool. It's a different way to look at Star Wars, through numbers and everything.
Yeah, I used to have a couple of those as graphs hanging in my classroom.
Yeah, they're super cool. I really like the book. I like the art of Star Wars Rebels, obviously.
Okay, that's a good one.
But I also like it's called Star Wars Propaganda.
Oh yeah,
and it's an in-universe book about the history of propaganda in the galaxy and the Republic's propaganda with the clone troopers, and then the way the Empire turned everyone against the Jedi with their propaganda, and and then it was like how rebel propaganda helped the rebellion, and all this stuff.
I like the 100 items. 100 items.
100 items is cool too.
Yeah.
Like walking through a museum.
And I have that big archive book. It's like a box with all the stuff in it, or I forget what it's called.
But so yeah, that was probably my biggest point from the whole thing, was just figuring out what you like. If you like a movie, find out if there's any tie-in books. Basically, all the movies since The Force Awakens had at least a couple of tie-in books, probably a lot more. If there's a character you like, see if they feature in any books, or if there's a book about them. I think like the one book Rebel Rising wasn't technically considered as a Rogue One tie-in book. It wasn't released in the lead up to Rogue One.
Right.
But if you really like Jyn in Rogue One, there's a book that basically details her young years from all the way from getting picked up by Saw Gerrera up to getting arrested and being in that prison. She's an interesting one because there are books that cover her entire life from birth to death.
Oh, okay.
Because the Rogue One tie-in book Catalyst is when she is born. And then it leads up to where she and her family are on that farm. And then Rebel Rising picks up to when she gets hidden on that farm and Saw Gerrera picks her up. And then that book leads up to Rogue One, and then Rogue One is her up to her death. So she's an interesting character.
Now, as an avid reader, does it count if someone says they read a book but they listen to the audiobook?
That's the big question. I think it counts.
Well, certain books, I like biographies. Like I read Anthony Daniels' biography, which I know is not a canon, but it's an urban.
Mm-hmm.
But I read it and then listened to the same chapters on audiobook because Anthony Daniels read it, and I thought it was really good. Same with when Ahsoka. I think isn't it Ashley Eckstein read that one?
Nash Eckstein narrated the Ahsoka book.
Yeah, so I thought that was really good.
And that actually ties into my next little point here, which is audiobooks versus audio dramas.
Oh, there we go.
So Star Wars does something really cool that I think not a lot of franchises really do anymore, at least, which is they make audio dramas that are fully produced with a full cast, sound effects, music, all that stuff. But they also have audiobooks. And so what's the difference between an audiobook and an audio drama? So an audiobook is a narration of the book, usually by just one person. Sometimes it's just like a voice actor they hired to narrate. Sometimes it is someone related to Star Wars, like we said, Ashley Eckstein narrated the Ahsoka novel. Versus an audio drama, like I said, is a full cast. Each character is voiced by a different person, or the same actor doing a different voice. And both typically have sound effects. Usually the audiobooks do put a little music and sound effects in, but it's not quite as emphasized as the audio dramas are.
Well, sometimes they'll advertise, like it'll say like sound effects from the Lucasfilm archives or something like that.
Yeah. But the biggest difference as far as listening to an audiobook or an audio drama is the writing. Because an audiobook is reading a book to you. So when a character is thinking something or they're doing something, it's being described to you the way you would read it in a book. Versus the audio dramas, there's really no description of anything. It's all the dialogue that you're hearing. It's more like a traditional radio play kind of idea. So I personally, I'm not a big audiobook person. I just prefer to read. I don't even like reading on like a Kindle. I like to have a physical book to read. This is how I am. But I do really like listening to the audio dramas because of that flair, and it's pretty easy to follow. And I enjoy this. But every Star Wars book is in audiobook form if you want to read it. There's actually a couple that right now that are only in audiobook form, which is Padawan's Pride, which I just podcasted with Sal on the Rogue Rebels about that. About Obi-Wan and Anakin, when Anakin's still young. They're sent on a little mission. There's also Seeds of Starlight, which is part of High Republic. That has a sequel coming out as well. Those are all Audible originals, currently only available in audiobook form. The audio dramas that are out is Count Dooku, as called Dooku Jedi Lost. Then there's the Aphra audio drama, which is a retelling of her role in the Darth Vader comics.
Right.
And I think that's my favorite audio drama.
Yeah, that's my favorite one because I had read the comics, but then I was like, I think I knew this from somewhere, and I realized it was just.
I read the comics after listening to the audio drama, and I think it made the comics better because I could hear Aphra's voice because it's pretty much 1-to-1, like all the dialogue's the same and everything.
Yeah.
I could hear 000's voice and everything. So it's really good. Then there's 2 High Republic audio dramas. No, there's 3 High Republic audio dramas. There's Tempest Runner, part of Phase 1, about one of the villains, Lorna D. Then there's Battle of Jeddah, part of Phase 2. It's the climactic battle of all the books. And then there's Tempest Breaker, part of Phase 3. It's a sequel to Tempest Runner.
Cool.
So, audiobooks versus audio dramas. But yeah. You can find any Star Wars books in audiobook form if that's how you prefer to experience them. They also do publish the scripts to the audio dramas, but it's, again, just a script. So you're reading it dialogue. It would be a play, not like you would read a book.
They do publish the scripts of the audiobooks. They're just called books.
Yes, they do that also. But yeah, so before my big thing at the bottom of my notes, I have written big and circled, is the High Republic, because that's the big one that seems to intimidate people a lot. So we'll talk about that. But before I do you have any questions or comments about Star Wars books so far?
No, well, I was going to ask about the High Republic. That was we must think alike. We must be related or something.
That's the big one.
Because I was going to ask that because the High Republic seems to me like for someone who hasn't read or is not into Star Wars right now, that'd be the way to go. Like, because it's like its own new, like you don't have to like battle the 40-year-old people that have been in the fandom for 40 some years. You can just jump right in.
Yeah. So yes, I'm going to talk about the High Republic. So the stuff I talked about earlier with books being connected and being not connected, with figuring out what you like, do still apply here, but also kind of don't apply. So I talk about books not being connected. I think hypothetically, you could pick up most High Republic books and read them and kind of figure out what's going on. If you just, if you, let's say you heard about a character you thought you'd really like, your friends told you would like the character of Wreath Silas, and you want to read the books he's in, you could keep up with that pretty easily. But the High Republic is a publishing initiative. It's not like the other Star Wars books where they, say, oh, we want to make a Ahsoka book, and then we want to make this trilogy about Alphabet Squadron and stuff like that, where it's kind of not that. The High Republic initiative tells a story altogether. It's sort of like the movies, right? You could probably turn on any movie and figure out what's going on, but all 9 the Skywalker Saga movies, they tell a story together. They're meant to be this one big story that goes along in phases. That's kind of how the High Republic is. So the High Republic, so I will say, I haven't read any of the High Republic comics.
Okay.
But that actually makes me think that the books are more accessible than people tend to believe. Because there are times where I'm reading a book and people from the comics show up and they're a big part of this book. And the book will have a couple paragraphs explaining what I need to know about these characters and their story and where they are at this point. And then I feel pretty caught up and it makes me just want to read the comics a little bit more. A great example of this was in a book with the characters Lula Talasola and Zine Morala. Huge characters in the High Republic Adventures, which I have not read, though I do plan to. When the book introduced, the book gave me a little bit of exposition saying who these characters were and their relationship to each other, and then I got it and I was on board and I read the book. And they tend to do that with a lot of the books. They'll give you a little blurb catching up, which is nice because sometimes a book comes out and then 2 years later the next one comes out and then I have to read that one, and it's a nice refresher when it's been a while since I read the previous book. But also sometimes it's not like you're missing. I mean, you are missing parts of the story in a sense, but it's not like you're missing, like you're not going to enjoy the new story. I read I believe it was Escape from Valo.
Okay.
No, not Escape from Valo. I'm going to look up what the book was. But I was reading a book that came out, a High Republic book that came out earlier last year. And I was reading it, and there was some like exposition catching me up on some of the characters and their relationships. And I thought, oh, these characters must be in some comics. And this book is catching me up on the comics really quick because that's what it felt like. But then it turned out that these characters were original to this book. So I think to me that says how good the books are at catching up on the comics when it's almost indistinguishable from just catching up in general on a character's life. So I don't think you need to worry too much. That said, I think to really appreciate the High Republic story, it is good to read them roughly in order.
Is there a list? Is there a list for new people where they can get them in order? Like,
Star Wars? So actually, I do recommend, if you want to get, and this goes for not just High Republic, for a lot of Star Wars books in general, one great website I recommend to find your Star Wars book is the website Uteeny. This is a fan-run website. I'm not sponsoring anything like that. It's other fans that I think have a really cool thing. But it's Uteeny, Youtini. Mm-hmm. They're really, really great resource for getting into Star Wars books and comics. And they have a guide on their website about getting into the High Republic and the books in order, essentially. Now, what's a bit unique about the High Republic as this big publishing initiative is that it comes in 3 phases. So phase 1 takes place 200 years before the Phantom Menace. That's 100 years before the Acolyte. So we're not even at the Acolyte.
So and the Acolyte. So because I was listening to a podcast, and they were trying to say the Acolyte was in the High Republic era, but wasn't it at the end of the High Republic era?
Yeah, High Republic's at the end of the High Republic era, 100 years after any of the books.
Okay.
So it's not really considered. It's like kind of High Republic, but not like High Republic proper.
Okay.
But so Phase 1 takes place 200 years before the High Republic. Here's the book I recommend if you want to get into the High Republic. The book I recommend is Light of the Jedi. It was the first High Republic book. I adored it. I read it in 2 sittings. I read the first half of the book, then I went to the bathroom, and then I read the second half of the book. I adored that book. I still do adore that book. It's phenomenal. It introduces you to all of the characters. I will say something that's fun about the High Republic compared to a lot of other Star Wars books is that there is art available for most major High Republic characters. So if you're reading a book and you're like, oh, I wonder what that guy looks like, they probably made art of him.
Yeah, I heard you and Sal talking about that, I think, at one time.
Yes, and that's also helpful. I'm not always the best with character names, so it is helpful when they say a name and I'm like, oh, who's that guy again? Oh, that's a Trandoshan. Okay. And be able to do that. So it's pretty cool. But yes, I recommend Light of the Jedi. It's the first High Republic book. It introduces most of the major players in Phase 1. It sets up what the galaxy is at that point and sets up the major conflict, which is with a terrorist pirate group called the Nihil. In the High Republic.
Okay.
The major. There's other things that happen, but they're the major antagonists of the book. And so Phase 1 is all about them. There's a mix of adult books and young adult books. Some people say skip all the young adult books. I think a lot of the young adult books do play important roles. I would recommend, like, it's on Utini, or you can just go on like StarWars.com. But if you can find the release order of the High Republic books, also every High Republic book has a list of the other books that came out with it in the front.
Oh, okay.
Book for you. So reading those. The main reason I suggest not skipping young adult books is because a lot of the characters introduced in those books become really major players in the adult books later. And
so you get their backstory right away?
Get their backstory right away and just learn who they are. Plus, the young adult books are very short. But most of the major moments are going to happen in the adult books. And the adult books are happy to catch you up on the young adult books. But personally, mostly because my favorite High Republic character is Vernestra. She is from the young adult books, mostly is in the young adult books. So I recommend them. But you probably can read the adult books and still keep up with it. You might just be missing some of the backstory here and there. But if you go on Utini, they do have a High Republic guide with everything in order. Yeah, so Phase 1 is 200 years before Phantom Menace. That was the first couple big waves of High Republic books and comics all coming out. Then Phase 2 of the High Republic is not the sequel to Phase 1.
It's just
Phase 2 is a prequel to Phase 1. So sort of like how with the Star Wars movies, we have the originals, then the prequels, and the sequels. They do the same thing with the High Republic. So while Phase 1 was 200 years before Phantom Menace, Phase 2 is 100 years before that. So 300 years before.
Oh, okay.
Now, I really adore Phase 2. A lot of really great characters in there. Phase 2, the main kind of antagonists of those are a cult called the Path of the Open Hand.
Okay.
And it's, if you read Phase 1, it's pretty obvious, but kind of spoilers. That cult becomes the Nihil in Phase 1. And Phase 2 kind of explores how the Nihil form in those early days, the origins of these beasts that they have called the Nameless. Kind of explores a lot of those origins and stuff like that. I really, really love Phase 2, and I do think everybody should read it. I think there's some really good stories in there. It has one of my favorite Jedi of all time, one of my favorite Jedi Padawan duos of all time, which is Solandra Sho and her Padawan Rupert Natani. It also has Axel Greylark, and he's a really fun character. But if you read Phase 1 and you just want to keep reading those characters, I think you could skip Phase 2. I think you'd be missing on some really, really great stories.
You're not telling people. You're not suggesting that, though.
I'm not suggesting to skip Phase 2. But I understand that everybody has time to read every single book.
Right.
So I'm trying to be diplomatic. So I don't want anyone to feel like they would be missing these key pieces to the story. I think phase 1 to phase 3 is a pretty coherent story still, but you get so much really great groundwork in phase 2, the origins of these like these groups that we're dealing with. You also like remember in Rogue One that Jedi statue that's laying on its side that fell down in phase 2 of the High Republic. And so I think you're missing out on a lot if you don't get into phase 2. But if you read phase 1 and you don't think phase 2 sounds interesting to you, you can go phase 1 to phase 3. I don't think you should. But if you only have so much time to read and you just want to keep reading your favorites from phase 1, I do understand. But so then phase 3 is the sequel to phase 1. Takes place pretty much right after, a couple years. And it's following up on those stories. Phase 3 still isn't complete yet for the High Republic. You have a couple months until the last High Republic Publishing Initiative book comes out this summer, but it's following up on phase 1. I recommend reading High Republic. Like I said, Utini has a list. I recommend reading High Republic books in release order. That's a pretty great way to do it, but you don't have to. I ended up reading phase 3 pretty out of order, and I was able to figure out and follow it along. Anyway, so the books do a pretty great job of explaining each other. So I think like in phase 3, there were a lot of big moves in the main conflict in the book, the young adult book, Defy the Storm. But then the next adult book is able to, catch you up on that if you forgot or if you didn't read that one. But yeah, so earlier when I said like the books don't really connect, you don't got to worry about it. That does go a little bit out the window in the High Republic. They're very connected. It's the kind of the point of it is to be this big connected publishing initiative. But that doesn't mean you can't pick up most of the books as long as especially if you're willing to spend a little time on Wikipedia to catch yourself up on stuff, I think you would have no problems picking up whatever High Republic books seem interesting to you. Especially if you're someone who wants to later read just want the young adult novels, you can do that. But
and since they're all what's nice about reading them in that order, it's not like the other ones that were just written over the years. Like they had a true plan for how the books to go.
Yes, this book is the High Republic is very much meant to be. They're all meant there's I think so. I don't want to spoil too much, but in there's a big incident on a planet called Valo. In the phase 1 in the High Republic, and there are 3 books plus comics that all are about that incident from different angles, from different people's perspectives, and it all fits together perfectly. While something's happening with the main characters of one book, you get little nods to what is happening to the main characters of another book over there. It's really cool. I love how connected everything is. I can't imagine how crazy the email threads of all the High Republic authors and writers and editors must be, making sure it all fits as tightly as it does. It's truly incredible. I know the point of this podcast is to help people get into it, but I just want to sing some extra praises to the High Republic. It's such a special era of Star Wars. They have a lot of freedom with it. And it really all fits like a glove. You have one author who writes a book, then a comic book writer picks up on them, and then an audiobook writer picks up from there, and another novel picks up from there, and it all works. I never feel like a character is different from one book to another unless they're supposed to be. And so much praise to the High Republic. The last book will be Trials of the Jedi, which comes out I believe in July, so this summer. But that doesn't mean High Republic era stories are over. It just means this publishing initiative will be concluding.
Yeah.
But yeah, getting into the High Republic, it seems very daunting. My recommendation is to read Light of the Jedi. It is one of the, because it's new characters and a new version of the galaxy that you're not used to. It's not super long, but it can feel very dense. And I understand that. But I think if you read Light of the Jedi, if you really like it, if you really love it, then I think you should start your High Republic journey and read all the books. If you're on it, I would say maybe pick up a young adult book, read that. It's a later read. I think Mission to Disaster would be, or no, not Mission. A Test of Courage would be a good, nice, very, very light read. High Republic book. It introduces Vernestra. So if you weren't sure about Light of the Jedi, pick up Mission to Disaster. See how you feel about that. If you're still into this era, that's okay. But I think the best intro is always going to be Light of the Jedi. Such a good book by Charles Soule. Fantastic book. Great intro into such an amazing part of the galaxy. But then again, going back to like our what do you like? If you don't care about the Jedi, High Republic's probably not for you. There are some books with more focus on non-Jedi characters, but the High Republic is about the Jedi at their best, right, in handling this huge conflict. And it's very almost, every book has a Jedi, even if it's not just about the Jedi, very Jedi-centric. So if you don't care for them or their philosophy or the Jedi Temple, you might not enjoy the High Republic very much, and that's okay. There are plenty of other Star Wars books out there for you where you have no Jedi or almost no Jedi.
Cool.
But I love the Jedi, so I love High Republic. Yeah, I feel like that was a lot. I hope I didn't scare anyone off from the High Republic. It is a lot of books, but there's no rush.
It's a good way to start.
Yeah, take your time. It's not a race to read them all. Read them at your own pace. I'm caught up right now, but I was behind on High Republic for a very long time, and I'm caught up now, and it's just fine. Whether you read slow, read fast. But I think the important thing, especially with Star Wars books, because I'm a bit of a completionist when it comes to stuff like this. I wanted to read all the books because I enjoy that. I enjoy all the Star Wars books and everything, but don't feel like you have to. Like, if you're reading a book and you're not enjoying it, go put it back. There's no pressure. Don't feel like you have to read a book so fast. If it takes you a year to read a book, then it takes you a year to read a book. And that's okay. Yeah. And it's, it should be fun. Star Wars should be fun. If you ever feel like Star Wars is stressing you out more than you're enjoying it, then it's totally okay. There's nothing wrong with stepping back. And that applies to the books too. Try them out, see how you feel. Like I said, if you like a character, Google that character. I also think, going through and reading some book synopses before you pick one can be good. Like I said, if you want to read about fast-paced flying and dogfights, I recommend the Alphabet Squadron trilogy.
Again, I see a whole article coming out of this.
I know, probably. But if you want to read like a slower, like more like a character study kind of book, read something like Bloodline. Not that that's slow, it's very, but you know what I mean. They're really great. So yeah. Any final questions or comments about the books?
No, I think that actually makes me want to think about reading some books.
Yeah, and I am happy to give, I don't want to open this and get like 100 messages, but if you aren't sure where to start and you know what you like, we have a little contact form on StarWarsGeekGirl.com. Fill it out. Tell me what movies you like. Tell me what shows you like. When I get a chance, I'll try to get back to you and recommend you a couple books.
Oh, that's awesome.
I made a little slideshow for my sister recommending what books I think she would like here recently. Cool. I don't know if she's going to read them, but I made it for her.
Hey, well, that's the start.
But, yeah. But thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Hopefully I hope I made it less intimidating. Worry made it more intimidating. Well, hopefully I made it less intimidating to get into
Well, they
Star
can
Wars.
read. They can now read a review of every book.
You can, yeah. So be able to read my Aftermath Empires End review, which is the last one I needed. But yeah, every book. Oh, one I didn't mention that I want to mention before I go. If you want something that's totally on its own, out of the blue, no connections besides the movies, I recommend the books. They're both by George Mann, Myths and Fables and Dark Legends. It's a
Okay.
collection of short stories, but they're like campfire stories you would hear passed around in universe of Star Wars.
Like a good Halloween Star Wars book.
Yeah, so Dark Legends is a very, very dark one. Myths and Fables is a bit more light.
Okay.
But it's like you have this sort of like basically like an Arthurian legend of a knight facing down a dragon. But it sounds like, and they don't make it very clear. They leave it up to interpretation, but it kind of sounds like it's Obi-Wan facing down a crate dragon.
Oh, cool.
On Tatooine. Cool. Or there's one called The Dark Wraith, and it's about this mysterious, shadowy figure wielding a crimson blade that can slash you down, and they just rage through a town, and all you can hear is his breathing. And it's Darth Vader, but he becomes this legend, and they're super cool. So I wanted to plug Myths and Fables and Dark Legends. Really, really good books. Dark Legends has one where they're on this like scary moon, and certain aliens who are a bit more like furry, kind of like Brutus and Skeleton Crew, they start to like become like feral because of like this moon. It's kind of like a werewolf story. It's so cool.
Cool.
So I recommend those. I think those were the second book review I ever did on Star Wars Geek was Myths and Fables and Dark Legends. Yeah. Really cool books. And those are, if you want something totally independent, those are the ones to go to. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. I hope I helped start your Star Wars book journey. Like I said, if you want some recommendations, I can't promise I'll get back to it right away, but fill out that submission, that contact form on StarWarsGeekGirl.com. I'll try to help if I know what you like. And what length you're looking for, especially because my favorite books are the Alphabet Squadron trilogy, but I hesitate to recommend those sometimes because they are 3 very long books. So if it's a little shorter, that's good to know too. Cool. They're so good. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining. Any final questions or comments?
No. I appreciate you.
Once again, where can everybody find you?
On TikTok, Hinton Star Wars Family, Instagram, and YouTube, and Blue Sky. Also, me and Safi did record a new episode of CreatorCast last month. So,
ooh,
didn't you listen to it?
No, I didn't know it was out.
There's a new episode. We recorded it. That when you had the pirate on. Marty. We recorded ours the Friday before you recorded yours.
Oh, I didn't know. Okay, I will find CreatorCast. I will find that and I'll listen to that
on Spotify.
On Spotify. For Star Wars Geek Girl, like I said, go to StarWarsGeek.com, fill out that submission form, whether it's you want book recs or if you just want to say hi. We have that there. You can also sign up for our newsletter, sign up for blog notifications, and vote in our awesome poll. This month, since February was Valentine's Day month, you could vote for your favorite couple in Star Wars. Right now, Kanan and Hera have a strong lead, so you'll contribute to that if you want to give them a stronger lead, or vote for someone else, I guess. You can follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky at SW Geek Girl, and on Facebook at Star Wars Geek Girl. If you're just looking for me personally, I'm on Instagram and TikTok at Spectre5 and on Blue Sky at Azoika.
Sounds awesome.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening. I was Zoe.
And I was Mike.
May the Force be with you, and goodbye.
Goodbye.